I slammed the front door behind me, my heart pounding with a mixture of rage and disbelief. There he was, Trent, stuffing his clothes into a suitcase like a common criminal making his getaway. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded, my voice trembling with barely contained fury. Trent spun around, his eyes widening briefly before narrowing into defiant slits. "I'm leaving you, Amelia, for Brianna." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind from my lungs. Brianna? That little tart from the office who batted her fake eyelashes at every man within a 10-mile radius? "You've got to be kidding me," I spat, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. "After everything we've been through together, you're just going to throw it all away for some cheap fling?" Trent's jaw tightened and he straightened to his full height, suddenly looking taller and colder than I'd ever seen him. "It's not a fling. I love her, and she's pregnant with my child." A harsh, bitter laugh escaped my lips. "Love? You don't know the first thing about love, you selfish bastard." His nostrils flared, and he took a step toward me, his fists clenched at his sides. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. I've put up with your nagging and your impossible expectations for far too long." I recoiled as if he'd struck me, the sting of his words cutting deeper than any physical blow ever could. This was the man I'd devoted the last 10 years of my life to, the one I'd sacrificed so much for in the hopes of building a life together. Squaring my shoulders, I met his icy glare head-on. "Get out," I said, my voice low and trembling with barely restrained rage. "Get out of my house, and don't ever come back." For a moment, I thought he might argue, might try to reason with me or plead for another chance. But then his expression hardened and he grabbed his suitcase, brushing past me without a backward glance. As the door slammed shut behind him, I sank to the floor, the tears I'd been holding back finally spilling over. How could everything have gone so wrong so quickly? And what was I going to do now? In the weeks that followed Trent's abrupt departure, I found myself consumed by a gnawing suspicion that refused to be ignored. His excuses for working late nights and weekends at the office had always seemed plausible enough, but now they rang hollow, each one a lie designed to cover his treacherous tracks. It started with little things. Lingering glances exchanged with that paralegal Brianna during meetings, hushed phone conversations that ended abruptly whenever I entered the room. At first, I chalked it up to my own insecurities, desperate to cling to the belief that the man I loved was still the person I thought I knew. But the evidence continued to mount, a trail of incriminating breadcrumbs that led me down a path I never wanted to travel. Unexplained charges on his credit card statements for expensive dinners and hotel rooms, the faint scent of an unfamiliar perfume clinging to his clothes, and always the ever-present shadow of Brianna, her calculating gaze fixed on my husband with undisguised hunger. "You're imagining things," Trent would insist whenever I dared to voice my concerns, his tone a mixture of condescension and annoyance. "Brianna is just a colleague, nothing more." Yet his words did little to assuage my doubts, and as the weeks turned into months, the chasm between us grew wider and more insurmountable. It all came to a head one evening when I returned home unexpectedly from a business trip. As I stepped through the front door, I heard the unmistakable sound of voices coming from our bedroom. Trent's deep baritone mingled with the higher, breathless tones of a woman. My heart pounding in my ears, I crept down the hallway, each step carrying me closer to a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. And there they were, tangled together on the bed we had once shared, their naked bodies intertwined in a grotesque parody of intimacy. Brianna's eyes widened with shock and fear when she saw me standing in the doorway, but Trent simply looked resigned, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. "Amelia," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "I was going to tell you." But his words were drowned out by the roar of rage that filled my ears, a primal scream torn from the depths of my shattered heart. In that moment, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again, and that the man I had once loved was nothing more than a stranger deserving of my hatred and contempt. With trembling hands, I clutched the damning evidence, photographs, emails, financial records, that laid bare the sordid truth of Trent's betrayal. The sting of his deceit burned like acid, eating away at the very core of who I thought I was. but I knew I couldn't allow myself to be consumed by the all-consuming flames of rage and despair. Not yet. Not until I had my revenge. That's why I found myself in Jessica's office that fateful afternoon, the weight of my secrets threatening to crush me beneath their burden. Jessica had been more than just a mentor to me over the years. She was a trusted friend, a confidant whose wisdom and guidance had steered me through more storms than I could count. "Amelia, what's wrong?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern as I sank into the chair across from her desk. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves before unleashing the torrent of words that had been building inside me. "It's Trent. He's been having an affair with Brianna, that little tramp from the paralegal pool." Jessica's eyes widened, but she remained silent, allowing me to purge the poisonous truth from my system. "I have proof," I continued, sliding the damning evidence across her desk. "Receipts, emails, even photographs of them together. He's been stealing from the firm, too, embezzling client funds to finance his sordid little rendezvous with that. Take it easy," Jessica soothed, her voice a calming balm against the raging inferno of my emotions. "We'll handle this, I promise. But you need to stay focused, Amelia. Don't let your anger cloud your judgment." I nodded, drawing in a shuddering breath as I fought to regain control. Jessica was right. As much as I wanted to unleash the full force of my fury upon Trent, I knew that blind rage would only undermine my efforts for justice. "What do you suggest?" I asked, my voice steadier now, my resolve hardening into an unbreakable core of determination. A glimmer of something predatory flickered in Jessica's eyes, and the corners of her mouth curved into a wolfish smile. "We're going to make him pay, Amelia. Every last cent, every shred of his precious reputation. We'll take it all from him, piece by agonizing piece." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't deny the thrill of anticipation that coursed through my veins. Trent had made the mistake of underestimating me, of believing that I was nothing more than a meek, subservient trophy wife, content to turn a blind eye to his misdeeds. But he was about to learn just how wrong he was, and by the time I was through with him, he would wish he had never been born. The look on Trent's face was one I would savor for the rest of my life, a potent cocktail of shock, disbelief, and dawning horror as he realized the noose was tightening around his neck. "You can't do this," he sputtered, his eyes wide and panicked as the senior partners delivered the news of his termination. "I'm one of the top attorneys at this firm." "Were," Jessica corrected, her tone icy and devoid of emotion. "Past tense, Mr. Reynolds. Your services are no longer required." I watched from the sidelines, a silent observer, as Trent's world crumbled around him. It was a masterful performance, one that had been weeks, no months, in the making, carefully orchestrated by Jessica and me to ensure his downfall was as complete and devastating as his betrayal. The evidence we had gathered, the financial records, the emails, the damning photographs, had painted a picture of gross misconduct and unethical behavior that even Trent couldn't talk his way out of. Not this time. "This is a mistake," he blustered, his face flushed with impotent rage. "A huge mistake. You'll be hearing from my lawyers." But even as the words left his lips, I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the realization that he had finally overplayed his hand and lost everything. As he stormed out of the conference room, I caught a glimpse of Brianna hovering in the hallway, her expression a mixture of fear and concern. Our eyes met for the briefest of moments, and I felt a surge of vindictive satisfaction at the sight of her distress. Let her worry, I thought coldly. Let her wonder what the future holds for her and her precious baby daddy now that his golden parachute has been ripped away. In the days and weeks that followed, I watched with a sense of grim satisfaction as Trent's once charmed life unraveled before his eyes. Stripped of his prestigious job and his primary source of income, he scrambled to find employment elsewhere, but his tarnished reputation preceded him at every turn. And through it all, I maintained a careful facade of ignorance, feigning concern and offering hollow reassurances whenever he dared to confide in me about his struggles. "I'm sure something will work out," I would say, my lips curved into a placid smile that betrayed none of the roiling contempt simmering beneath the surface. "You're a talented lawyer, Trent. Someone is bound to see your value eventually." But deep down, I knew the truth. that his value had been squandered long ago, sacrificed on the altar of his own greed and hubris. And as the walls closed in around him, I reveled in the knowledge that his downfall was only just beginning. The shrill ring of my cell phone pierced the silence, shattering the fragile peace I had so carefully cultivated in the aftermath of Trent's professional demise. I knew who it was before I even glanced at the caller ID, the same person who had been hounding me relentlessly for weeks with demands and ultimatums. Brianna. With a weary sigh, I accepted the call, bracing myself for the onslaught of venom and vitriol that was sure to follow. "What do you want, Brianna?" I asked, my tone flat and devoid of emotion. "You know damn well what I want," she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. "I want you to stop playing these stupid games and let Trent go. He's miserable, and it's all because of you." I couldn't help but laugh, a harsh, bitter sound that seemed to take her by surprise. Miserable? He brought this on himself with his lies and his cheating. I'm just enjoying the show. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought our connection might have been severed. But then her voice returned, low and venomous. "You're going to regret this, Amelia. Mark my words. Trent is going to leave you, and when he does, he's going to take everything with him. The house, the money, everything. You'll be left with nothing." A chill ran down my spine at the naked threat in her words, but I refused to let her see how deeply they had struck. "Is that so?" I countered, injecting as much bravado into my voice as I could muster. "We'll just see about that." The line went dead, and I slowly lowered the phone, my hands trembling slightly. Brianna's warning had been chilling, but deep down, I knew she was right. Trent wouldn't stay down for long. He was a fighter, a survivor, and sooner or later, he would find a way to claw his way back to the top. And when he did, I had no doubt that he would come for me with everything he had. The thought should have filled me with dread, but instead, I found myself growing oddly calm, a sense of grim determination settling over me like a shroud. If Trent wanted a fight, then a fight was what he would get. I was prepared to go to any lengths necessary to ensure his downfall was complete and irreversible. The days that followed were a blur of activity, each one bringing new challenges and obstacles to overcome. But through it all, I remained focused, my eye fixed firmly on the ultimate prize, the total and utter destruction of the man who had so callously betrayed me. And then, one fateful evening, the opportunity I had been waiting for finally presented itself. Trent stormed into the house, his face flushed with rage, and for a moment I thought he might strike me. But instead, he simply stood there, trembling with barely contained fury, his eyes boring into mine with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. "You did this," he hissed, his voice little more than a guttural snarl. "You're the one who turned me in, who destroyed everything I've worked for." I met his accusation with a cool, level gaze, refusing to rise to the bait. "I don't know what you're talking about, Trent," I lied smoothly. "But if you've done something illegal, then you have no one to blame but yourself." His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment I thought he might lash out. But then, as quickly as it had come, the storm seemed to pass, and he simply deflated, the fight draining out of him like air from a punctured balloon. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Brianna is pregnant, and we're going to start a new life together, far away from here, and far away from you." I felt a surge of savage triumph well up inside me, but I kept my expression carefully neutral. "If that's what you want," I replied evenly, "I won't stand in your way." As he turned and walked out the door, I couldn't help but allow a small, satisfied smile to creep across my face. The trap had been set, and he had walked right into it, just as I had always known he would. The sharp rap of knuckles against wood reverberated through the still morning air, shattering the tense silence that had enveloped the house like a shroud. I rose from my seat at the kitchen table, my heart pounding in my chest as I made my way to the front door. This was it. The moment I had been both dreading and anticipating for what felt like an eternity. With trembling hands, I pulled open the door to reveal two stern-faced police officers standing on my doorstep, their expressions grim and unyielding. "Amelia Reynolds?" the taller of the two asked, his voice clipped and professional. I nodded mutely, my throat too constricted with fear and adrenaline to form words. "We have a warrant for the arrest of your husband, Trent Reynolds," the officer continued, brandishing a sheaf of official-looking documents. "He's being charged with embezzlement, fraud, and multiple counts of legal malpractice." A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I gripped the doorframe for support as the full weight of the officer's words sank in. This was the endgame, the culmination of months of careful planning and meticulous execution. And yet, even as a part of me thrilled at the prospect of finally seeing Trent brought to justice, another part couldn't help but feel a twinge of regret. A nagging voice that whispered of the life we might have had if things had been different. But I quickly silenced that voice, steeling myself against the onslaught of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. This was no time for sentimentality or second-guessing. I don't know where he is," I lied, my voice steadier than I had expected. "He moved out weeks ago after we separated." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening ever so slightly. "We have reason to believe he's been staying here, ma'am," the taller one said, his gaze boring into mine with unsettling intensity. "If you're harboring a fugitive, you could be charged as an accessory." My heart stuttered in my chest, but I refused to let my fear show. "I'm not harboring anyone," I insisted, meeting his stare with one of my own. "Trent left, and I haven't seen or heard from him since." There was a tense moment of silence, during which I could almost hear the gears turning in the officers' minds as they weighed the veracity of my words. Finally, the shorter one spoke up, his tone slightly less confrontational than his partner's. "If you do happen to hear from Mr. Reynolds, ma'am, we'd appreciate it if you gave us a call," he said, handing me a business card. "He's got a lot of questions to answer." I nodded mutely, accepting the card with fingers that trembled ever so slightly. As the officers turned and made their way back to their squad car, I couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction wash over me. The wheels of justice were finally in motion, and Trent, arrogant, deceitful Trent, was about to learn a harsh lesson about the consequences of his actions. As I watched the police car pull away from the curb, I allowed myself a small, triumphant smile. It was only the beginning, but oh, how sweet it tasted. The courtroom was a study in contrasts, the rich, polished wood paneling and the somber black robes of the judge standing in stark juxtaposition to the raw, roiling emotions that simmered just beneath the surface. On one side of the aisle sat Trent, his once confident demeanor replaced by a hunched, haunted look that spoke volumes about the toll his downfall had taken. Beside him, Brianna radiated a mixture of defiance and fear, her hand resting protectively on the swell of her pregnant belly. And on the other side, I sat ramrod straight, my gaze fixed on the man who had once been my husband, the father of the child I had so desperately wanted but never had. A kaleidoscope of emotions churned within me, anger, hurt, a perverse sense of vindication, but I refused to let any of them show. This was my moment, the culmination of months of careful planning and strategic maneuvering, and I would be damned if I let Trent or anyone else rob me of the satisfaction I so richly deserved. The proceedings began with a flurry of legal jargon and procedural formalities, but I tuned it all out, focusing instead on the steady thrum of my heartbeat and the weight of the evidence folder in my hands. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the prosecutor called me to the stand, and I rose to my feet, smoothing the front of my skirt with trembling hands. "Mrs. Reynolds," the lawyer began, his tone all business, "can you please describe for the court the nature of your relationship with the defendant?" I took a deep breath, willing my voice to remain steady and even. "Trent and I were married for 10 years, I replied, my gaze flickering briefly to where he sat, his expression unreadable. "We met through my father, who was Trent's boss at the law firm where we both worked." The prosecutor nodded, jotting down a few notes. "And would you say your marriage was a happy one, Mrs. Reynolds?" A bitter laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. "Happy?" I echoed, shaking my head ruefully. "No, I wouldn't say that at all. Trent was a liar and a cheat, and he betrayed me in the worst possible way." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and I could see Trent's jaw tighten, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. "Objection, Your Honor," his lawyer interjected, rising to his feet. "Relevance?" The judge fixed me with a stern look. "Mrs. Reynolds, please confine your testimony to the facts pertaining to the charges against the defendant." I nodded, taking another steadying breath. Of course, Your Honor. As I was saying, Trent betrayed my trust by carrying on an affair with a younger woman, Brianna Wilkins, who was a paralegal at our firm. Brianna's head snapped up at the sound of her name, her eyes narrowing into hostile slits. Not only that, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, but Trent also misappropriated client funds to finance his lavish lifestyle with his mistress. Expensive dinners, hotel rooms, you name it. He stole from the firm, from our clients, and from me. The prosecutor circled around to face me, his expression grave. And what evidence do you have to support these allegations, Mrs. Reynolds? With a sense of grim satisfaction, I lifted the folder in my hands and began to methodically lay out the damning paper trail, bank statements, emails, photographs that had taken me months to assemble. As each new piece of evidence was entered into the record, I could see the color draining from Trent's face, his mask of bravado crumbling before my very eyes. By the time I had finished my testimony, there was no doubt in anyone's mind as to the depths of his depravity or the certainty of his guilt. As I stepped down from the witness stand, I allowed myself a small, triumphant smile. Justice, it seemed, was finally being served. The sharp rap of the gavel echoed through the hushed courtroom, signaling the end of what had been an agonizing ordeal. As the judge pronounced the sentence, 10 years with no possibility of parole, a wave of relief washed over me, so powerful that I nearly buckled under its weight. It was finally over. The lies, the betrayal, the endless months of anguish and plotting, all of it had culminated in this single, defining moment. I turned to look at Trent, drinking in the sight of his stricken expression, the way his shoulders slumped in defeat as the gravity of his punishment sank in. For a fleeting instant our eyes met, and I saw a flicker of something in his gaze. Regret, perhaps, or maybe just a glimmer of the man he used to be. But then the moment passed, and the guards were ushering him away, his wrists bound in cold, unforgiving steel. As he disappeared through the door that led to the holding cells, I couldn't help but feel a sense of hollow victory. This was what I had wanted, what I had fought so hard for, to see him brought low, stripped of his arrogance and his ill-gotten gains. And yet, even as I basked in the sweet taste of revenge, a part of me couldn't help but wonder if the price had been too high. The weeks and months that followed passed in a blur, a whirlwind of legal proceedings and media scrutiny as the details of Trent's downfall played out in the public eye. Through it all, I remained stoic and resolute, refusing to let the weight of my actions crush me beneath its burden. And then, one day it was over. The divorce finalized, the assets divided, and the last vestiges of my former life neatly severed. As I stood in the empty shell of what had once been our home, I ran my fingers over the smooth, polished surface of the kitchen counter, tracing the invisible scars left by 1,000 arguments and bitter recriminations. In the end, I had won. Or at least, that's what the world saw. Trent was behind bars, disgraced and disbarred, his once promising career reduced to ashes. And I, the wronged wife, had emerged victorious, my reputation and my finances intact. But as I surveyed the hollow emptiness of the house that had once been filled with the sounds of laughter and the promise of a future, I couldn't help but wonder if the cost of my revenge had been too high. The sound of a knock at the door startled me from my reverie, and I turned to find Brianna standing on the doorstep, her eyes red-rimmed and her face drawn with exhaustion. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. She flinched as if I had struck her, her arms tightening around the bundle cradled against her chest, a tiny, squirming infant swaddled in a pale blue blanket. She faltered, her gaze dropping to the floor. I wanted to apologize for everything. I regarded her in silence, taking in the sight of her disheveled appearance, the dark circles etched beneath her eyes. This was the woman who had nearly destroyed my life, the one who had seduced my husband and torn my world apart with her lies and her wanton selfishness. And yet, as I looked at her now, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity. "Keep your apologies," I said, my voice softening ever so slightly. "Just take care of that baby. Give it the life it deserves." Brianna's eyes widened, and for a moment I thought she might protest, but then she simply nodded, a single tear tracing its way down her cheek. As she turned and walked away, cradling her child against her chest, I couldn't help but wonder if this was what victory was supposed to feel like. Hollow, empty, devoid of any real satisfaction or closure. Perhaps in the end we had both lost more than we could ever hope to regain.